start again on the Satipatthana Sutta. And so far we have looked at the contemplation of body, the Kaya Nupassana. We have looked at the contemplation of feeling, the Vedana Nupassana. And now we move on to the contemplation of mind, the Chitta Nupassana. And this is how this part goes. And how, bhikkhus, does a bhikkhu abide contemplating certain aspects of mind? Here a bhikkhu understands mind affected by lust as mind affected by lust, and mind unaffected by lust as mind unaffected by lust. He understands mind affected by hate as mind affected by hate, and mind unaffected by hate as mind unaffected by hate. He understands mind affected by delusion as mind affected by delusion, and mind unaffected by delusion as mind unaffected by delusion. He understands contracted mind as contracted mind, and distracted mind as distracted mind. He understands exalted mind as exalted, and unexalted mind as unexalted. He understands surpassed mind as surpassed, and unsurpassed mind as unsurpassed. He understands stilled mind as stilled, and non-stilled mind as non-stilled. And he understands liberated mind as liberated, and unliberated mind as unliberated. So here you have a large number of mental states. So you can see here that contemplating mind really refers to contemplating the various aspects, the various qualities of mind. And again, there is this distinction here between, on the one hand, the defiled aspects of mind, right? You have it says lust here. I'm not sure if lust is such a good translation. It's more like desire, really, and any kind of desires. And all of these things going down there are basically defiled aspects of mind. And then the last part, from exalted onwards, that is contrasting the mind states which are not defiled with those that are defiled. So exalted versus unexalted, etc. So again, it's this what we're dealing with here. Again, you can see how it is all about understanding the defilements, but understanding the problems of meditation, and then moving towards aspects where those problems have disappeared completely. And towards the very end of this list, we have things like the stilled mind and the liberated mind. And these actually usually refer to, there's also the exalted mind, the Mahagata. Mahagata means gone grey. This is usually a term for the Brahma Viharas, and again, it refers to Samadhi, it refers to the jhanas and these kind of states. So all of this towards the bottom here actually refers to jhana states and the other profound states of Samadhi. And that is interesting. I have been telling you all along on this retreat that Satipatthana, or right mindfulness, is what takes you to the jhanas, and here it actually is included, right? So this is kind of slightly self-contradictory. This is the sort of thing you might say, well, what I said first doesn't agree with what I said afterwards, etc. This is one of the standard, the reason when the monks are laughing here, because this is one of the standard things you read in the suttas when they argue with each other. Say, what you said first doesn't agree with what you said afterwards. Save your doctrine. That's how they argue with each other in the suttas. And the reason is that I think that Satipatthana can be viewed from two different angles. And it can be viewed, the most general understanding of Satipatthana practice is Satipatthana is the source or the cause for Samma Samadhi, for jhana and for right stillness. That is the most prevalent usage of Satipatthana in the suttas. But occasionally, and especially here, also slightly with the previous one in feelings, we're talking about the Niramisa Sukha. Niramisa Sukha usually refers to Samadhi, deep Samadhi states. And here it also includes the contemplation of the jhanas themselves. And in this way, when Satipatthana includes that, as it does in the Satipatthana Sutta, but very few other places, then of course it becomes a complete path to awakening here, because it includes the contemplation of everything, all possible phenomena, including the jhanas themselves. Usually in the suttas there is a tenfold path, and that tenfold path is slight variation on the Eightfold Path. So after the 8 factors Samma Samadhi, you have Samma Jnana, right knowledge, and then you have Samma Vimutti after that. Now, in this case, it looks like Satipatthana includes that Samma Jnana, which comes after Samma Samadhi, after the full jhana experience or the full samadhi experiences. So it's a little bit flexible. None of these concepts can be pinned down with absolute accuracy. They have a certain flexibility built into them. Sometimes one concept overlaps with another one. It's not absolute, clear definitions. There's some fluidity in these things. So when I say certain things, often they're not absolute. There is a certain degree of flexibility in these things. It's important to keep that in mind. And often when the Buddha says things, often what he says can have different shades of meaning, different meanings. And this is another important tool for interpreting the suttas properly, to remember that. There's one verse somewhere in the Anguttara Nikaya, I think the Anguttara 9s or something, which talks about the seamstress. And I can't remember exactly how it goes now, the seamstress sutta. And different monks interpret this sutta in different ways. And they all, let's think about 6 different monks or something, and they all go to the Buddha and say, well, I interpret in this way, but this one over here, he interprets in that way, and this third one, he interprets differently again. And then they ask the Buddha, which one of us is right? There's all these different interpretations of this verse that you have spoken. And then the Buddha says, you're all right. These are all acceptable interpretations. These are different ways of regarding this. And then the Buddha says, and here is my interpretation, which is another one yet again. So this is sometimes true in the suttas, especially when it comes to verse, because verse is often meant as a kind of uplifting and inspiring thing, to inspire the heart and bring you forward on the path. This is what verse is about. In prose, this is prose we're reading now. In prose it is more it is not as flexible, because prose, obviously, you can basically say whatever you like in prose. You can structure things exactly the way you want to. In verse, the structure is more limited, because it has to rhyme, it has to have a certain meter and all these kind of things. So in verse, things are a bit more flexible. But in prose, not as flexible. But even in prose, it's important to remember that things can have different meanings. It's not always completely set in concrete. There's not always only one interpretation which is right. There can be overlapping interpretations of these things. Okay. So these are the mind states, and all of these are then... so we have lust, which really means desire. We have hate. Hate is a very strong word. It means basically ill will, right? Any kind of ill will, from the kind of slightest kind of irritation to the most raging rage. And then a delusion. And delusion here does not mean necessarily the profound delusions of not seeing anatta, not understanding the 3 tilakkhana, the 3 characteristics of existence, anicca, dukkha, anatta. It doesn't mean that kind of delusion necessarily. Here delusion is a more kind of shallow kind of delusion, being confused, right? Being tired, being restless, having doubts, this kind of delusion. And the reason for that is because this is the word here is moha in Pali. It is possible to have the amoha without moha, to make good karma. And that doesn't mean that you're an arahant, it just means you're making good karma because you don't have any confusion or restlessness in the mind. So this is delusion in a kind of more shallow sense than the profound delusion. Avidya is really the deepest kind of delusion. Moha is a bit more shallow on my reading of the suttas. And he understands the contracted mind as contracted. Contracted mind usually is a reference to tiredness and lethargy, often called sloth and torpor, which is a bit old-fashioned, but tiredness and lethargy might be better. Right? You feel kind of contracted inside of yourself. You can't really. The mind doesn't really want to work properly. It says in the suttas, it's like being in prison when you have tiredness and lethargy. You're kind of locked into this thing. You can't really. You can't really communicate properly with the world outside. You're kind of locked into yourself. And the distracted mind is usually regarded as the mind which is restless or agitated, going out into the 5 senses, not settling down into samadhi. So these are, you can see there, four, perhaps all five of the five hindrances are there, but this time looking at it from the mental perspective. And then we have the opposites. We have the exalted mind states. Once the hindrances are abandoned, then we can talk about the exalted mind states, the mahagata citta, the mind, the great mind, the surpassed and the unsurpassed mind. Unsurpassed in the sense that you reach certain peak experiences. For example, in the third jhana, you reach the peak of sukha. There's no sukha beyond the third jhana. So it's the unsurpassed sukha in the world you reach in the third jhana. So in the jhanas you come into these peak experiences which cannot be surpassed. So this is the highest degree of happiness you can have in the world. Samadhi, samahita mind, stilled mind, and finally the liberated mind, vimutta citta. And liberated from what? Usually liberation is from the defilements, the hindrances. So again, this is a reference to samadhi, and ultimately also a references to the stages of awakening, especially arahantship. So there you are. So that is the contemplation of mind, and you can see we're still dealing with the same theme of defilements and liberation from defilements. This is kind of the thorough, the kind of through-going theme in all of these suttas and the whole path, basically. And then, in this way, he abides contemplating mind, certain aspects of mind internally, or he abides contemplating certain aspects of mind externally, or he abides contemplating certain aspects of mind both internally and externally. And he abides independent, not clinging to anything in the world. That is how a bhikkhu abides contemplating certain aspects of mind. So again, internally about yourself, externally probably means other people, other animals, other beings, any beings of any type. And then eternally, externally is when you universalize and you realize there is nothing apart from this. This comprises the whole universe. Everybody is comprised of these things. And that is when you understand the limits of samsara, right? When you understand that all beings have these mind states. Everybody is affected by these things. Defilements, non-defilements. When you see that, you understand there's no escape from these things. This is what samsara is composed of. It's composed of these things. You cannot go beyond this. This will always be part of you, no matter where you go. This is little bit part of the understanding that arises from this sort of contemplation. Okay, so that is the third satipatthana, the citta nupassana. We will now move on to the dhamma nupassana. And Dhamma, as I said, can perhaps be translated as principles. Perhaps it is not. It is a bit difficult to translate this word always. What is the best translation is often hard to figure out. Anyway, this is how it goes. And how bhikkhus does a bhikkhu abide contemplating certain principles among principles, certain laws of causality among laws of causality, perhaps. Here a bhikkhu abides contemplating certain principles in terms of the five hindrances. And how does a bhikkhu abide contemplating certain principles in terms of the five hindrances? Here, there being sensual desire, kama, chanda, in him, a bhikkhu understands there is kama, chanda in me. And there being no kama, chanda in him, sensual desire, he understands there is no sensual desire in me. And he also understands how there comes to be the arising of unarisen sensual desire, and how there comes to be the abandoning of arisen sensual desire, and how there comes to be the future non-arising of abandoned sensual desire. So this is the contemplation of the hindrances. So you can see here why it is called Dhamma, why it is principles, why it is the laws of causality that are involved here, because it's all about understanding the causality, how these things come into being, and how they are avoided in the future. And all that is about causality. Buddhism is a teaching about causality through and through. One of the most important teachings in Buddhism, of course, is paticca samuppada, dependent origination, which is basically the causal law for the origination of everything, of the five khandhas, of dukkha, of the world, essentially. So, and all things can be explained in terms of causality, and that is the way it has to be. When there is no essence in anything, when there's nothing that stands by itself, solidly, which is immovable, that does not, is independent of all phenomena. If there's no such thing, then the only alternative is that things are caused by causes. So, Buddhism, therefore, is a teaching on causality, if anything. So that is why this is the Dhammanupassana. It's about causality. So the first things to contemplate here is the five hindrances again, right? Back again to these defilements. Goes on and on for every exercise. Everything we do here is about thinking about, after a while you get fed up, you think, well, all these defilements, I've had enough of these defilements. And of course that's the whole point. You're supposed to have enough of the defilements. So here we are then moving towards the very refined end of the defilements. As I said before, when we come to the five hindrances, as a group, they are known often as the upakilesas, and that basically means something like the refined kilesas of the mind. It's an interesting little point that the word kilesa, which is often used in Buddhist discourse when we talk about defilements. The word kilesa, it only occurs very rarely in the suttas. It occurs more commonly in the commentarial literature. In the suttas, the more common term is upakilesa, and referring to the refined defilements. For example, the Upakilesa Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya is all about the very last fine defilements you have left before you enter the jhana states. It's a very nice sutta. I recommend you to read that one, Majjhima 128, Upakilesa Sutta, all about how to deal with the mind before samadhi. You have in the Vatupama Sutta, the simile of the cloth, Majjhima 7, also you have Upakilesas. There it is a large range of various defilements, and then sometimes the five hindrances are called Upakilesa as well. Anyway, so here we are dealing with the five hindrances. Now we're coming very close, right? We're coming to the final kind of barriers towards samadhi. So that is why it says, he understands when there is sensual desire in me. I understand that he understands there is sensual desire in him. The bhikkhu understands this, or the bhikkhuni, or the layperson, whoever is serious about meditation practice. And of course, that is not always easy. As I mentioned before, these hindrances can be very, very refined. The very last attachments to the body, the very last attachments to the things of the world. This is about the absolute elimination. This is not coarse craving, right? This is very, very refined things, very last attachments. And this is the sort of thing that will block you from entering samadhi, especially the first one of these, because you're not able to let go of that world. It's quite hard, right? We are so used to living, existing in the world of the five senses. This is all we know, the five senses. This is our whole life is lived in this world. From the moment you wake up in the morning, you open your eyes, right? All you see is things around you, you hear things, you taste things, you smell things, you touch things. Everything, our whole life is in these things. Then you go to sleep at night and you dream about these things. Even at sleep, you don't get away from these things. It is always there. And then we are asked to leave this behind and enter some other existence. Okay, so the suttas say this existence is much better, but we don't know that. There has to be a little bit of confidence and trust there. It feels like it is much better because we've been heading towards this beautiful bliss and peace and beautiful states of mind for a long time already. So it feels right, but it still takes that last measure of confidence and faith to let go of this whole world and move into a higher realm, the Rupa Vachara, the Rupa Loka, the higher world. And that is why it is so hard, and that is why there is so much contemplation at this particular stage to be able to abandon this. So you understand this, so it means you understand fully all aspects of kama chanda, all aspects of sensual desire, right? In its whole scope. That is what you understand here. And you understand when there is no sensual desire in you, right? You understand the freedom, and often perhaps always, you have to actually abandon sensual desire completely, sometimes to really be able to understand what it is. Because only then can you kind of look back and say, okay, now I understand what it is. While you're a fish in the water, you don't understand what the water is. Or while you're the tadpole in the water, you don't understand. Only when you become a frog can you know what water is. And the same kind of thing with sensual desire here. That's when you get the full understanding here. And then he understands how there comes to be the arising of unarisen sensual desire. This is where causality comes in here. You understand the causes for sensual desire to arise in the mind. So what is that cause? Obviously you have to see these things for yourself. When you see it for yourself, that is when it becomes very powerful. It becomes a real insight and a real understanding, and something you can use in your own practice. But it's nice to know what the Buddha said about this as well. And the Buddha says that the cause for the arising of sensual desire is the subha nimitta. Subha means beautiful, nimitta means like the characteristic, or the feature, or the mark, or the sign. In other words, whatever aspect in something that is beautiful, right? That is what the subha nimitta is. And the subha nimitta is not something that exists in the object. It exists in your mind. It just depends how you look at the object, whether you see the subha nimitta or not. It is not inherent in the object. It is how you look that makes it either subha or asubha. And this is sort of the point here, right? If you understand that when I look at it this way, then I see it subha, but when I remember that it is impermanent, it cannot be held on to, and it will soon fade, then you remember the asubha aspect, then the kamacchanda does not arise. So by understanding the causality, you understand how you can shift your perception in a different direction, so you don't allow the kamacchanda to arise. The sort of thing we have been talking about on this retreat throughout. Shifting your perception, seeing the object in a different way, right? Giving rise to a different understanding in the mind. So this is how we can use causality and use our training here to change, to avoid these kind of things. And he understands how there comes to be the abandoning of arisen sensual desire, right? I was just saying now, it arises if the subha nimitta is there, you see the beautiful in something, then you shift your perception to the asubha nimitta. You see a beautiful person, and then you think, actually, this is impermanent, this will change. I can't hold on to this. Before I know it, it will be gone. It will be faded away. Beauty is just a temporary, temporary phenomena coming together before it fades very quickly again and is gone. Just like a flower, right? A flower being beautiful one day, and a few days later it is completely gone and nothing left of it. So we shift our perception. We learn how to look at things in a new way. So we abandon the sensual desire in this way. And then finally, how there comes to be the future non-arising of abandoned sensual desire. And of course, this means that you, ideally, this means that you keep on practicing samadhi. In a samadhi state, you abandon these defilements completely. The 5 hindrances are completely gone. So this is how it stays abandoned in the future if you keep on practicing samadhi. And ideally, eventually, you eradicate it completely by practicing the path to the end. So this is how how you do this kind of practice. So there you are. So it's all about causality and all about understanding causality, really, at this stage. Let's have a look at the other 5 hindrances very briefly. The next one is about ill will. There being ill will in him. A bhikkhu understands there is ill will in me, and there being no ill will in him, he understands there is no ill will in me. And he also understands how there comes to be the arising of unarisen ill will, and how there comes to be the abandoning of arisen ill will, and how there comes to be the future non-arising of abandoned ill will. So again, you understand ill will in all its aspects, right? He understands there is ill will in me, and he understands when there's nothing there. And that's when you get the full perspective and you get the full understanding of ill will, once it's completely abandoned. And he understands how the arising of ill will happens. How does it arise? And it's good, again, you have to contemplate this for yourself and see how it arises. And once you contemplate this and you start to understand this, it becomes a powerful insight that you can use in your practice. But again, the Buddha gives advice on this, as always, and it says it's the patiga nimitta, which gives rise to ill will. And patiga is like resistance, right? You are resistant to something. It's something you don't want. You don't want this painful feeling. You don't want this troublesome person, right? You feel a sense of resistance towards a certain experience. And when that resistance arises, then ill will can often follow as a consequence. So that is the problem. So then you learn to change your perception. If there is a troublesome person who you think is difficult, you learn to see them in a new way. You learn to see them with compassion. You learn to see the good aspects. All of these things that we've been talking about over these last few days. You change the perspective. It's all about, remember again, the nimitta, the sign. How we view something is not inherent in the object. There's nothing is really inherent in the object. Everything is inherent in our mind. It's how we apply the mind. That is what matters. And this is also the great thing, because if it was inherent in the object, there would be nothing we could do about it. Nothing we can do if the ill will has to arise because the object is inherently repulsive. But precisely because it is about us, because it is our attitude, and that is what gives us the hope of actually changing things, right? Then we can develop, we can change our perceptions, and we can move in a different direction. This is the whole point, is that actually it is about us. Sometimes you feel like, oh no, it's all about me, I have to change. And of course that can feel kind of difficult to admit, right? That it's all about us, not about anybody out there. But actually, once you understand that actually is a very liberating thing, because that is what gives you scope to change. Then you can't change the world, but you can change yourself, right? So this is kind of actually a very positive thing, that it is about us and not about the world out there or people out there. That is what gives us scope for change and scope to for awakening. Okay. Next one here. There being sloth and torpor, or if you like, tiredness and lethargy in him. I will read this out in full. There being this in him, he understands there is tiredness and lethargy in me. And there being no tiredness and lethargy in him, he understands there is no tiredness and lethargy in me. And he also understands how there comes to be the arising of unarisen tiredness and lethargy, and how there comes to be the abandoning of arisen tiredness and lethargy, and how there comes to be the future non-arising of abandoned tiredness and lethargy. So here you understand the causes of this, and again it is about how we use our mind that gives rise to these things. As I said before, much of the tiredness and lethargy, much of the tina middha is a consequence of the first two defilements, right? So by abandoning the first two defilements, you're abandoning the majority of tina middha. But there's a certain amount left over at the end of the day, a certain amount which is still there, even when the first two hindrances are very much abandoned. There's only a little bit left of them, perhaps. Tina middha then becomes more independent, and it can become a consequence of other factors. It can be a consequence of delusion, the consequence of a sense of self, right? A sense of self. Remember, when you move towards samadhi, your sense of self is challenged, right? So many of the things that you take to be yourself have to be abandoned on the path to samadhi. You're losing control over things. That's what it feels like. You're giving up the doer. You're giving up the will inside. All of these things are given up, and that is like it's like frightening. It's quite fearful. So when the delusion and the sense of self is challenged, one consequence of that can be tina middha, sloth or tiredness and lethargy, or it can be restlessness, which is the next hindrance. Here there are more things that can be, as you move towards samadhi, there are more things that can give rise to these kind of defilements. And to read about that again, I would recommend you to have a look at the Upakilesa Sutta that I just mentioned before, because it talks about these defilements, these refined defilements in much greater detail. So if you are a person whose samadhi is going very well, And some of you here are getting very nice samadhi. That's very always very inspiring to hear, and people are getting nice results. That is a kind of sutta you might want to consult with and have a look at. And then if you have any questions about it, you can ask people who are skilled in samadhi practice. So that is sloth and torpor. Then you abandon that by, again, learning to focus in a different way according to yoniso manasikara. And then, so that is how, and then the abandonment comes about, and then you, again here too, you continue attaining samadhi, and by continuously applying yourself to samadhi, especially the jhana states, you will abandon these defilements more or less on a permanent basis, at least until you get the final breakthroughs to the stages of awakening here. Then we have restlessness and remorse, uddhacca, kukucca, and the same thing applies here. You know its presence, you know when it's not there, right? You know these things fully. And of course, towards the end of the practice, as you are approaching samadhi, restlessness takes very, very refined forms. Things like the nimitta not being 100% stable and this sort of thing. The light in the mind or whatever. So very, very refined forms. And again, it takes a bit of insight to understand why it is still there, and often it has with a sense of self wanting to exert itself, or perhaps there being some desire or these kind of things lying behind there. And then again, it is samadhi which overcomes this completely. And the last one, there being doubt in him. A bhikkhu understands there is doubt in me, or there being no doubt in him, he understands there is no doubt in me. And he understands how there comes to be the arising of unarisen doubt, and how there comes to be the abandoning of arisen doubt, and how there comes to be the future non-arising of abandoned doubt. So what is doubt? What does doubt mean? The word doubt in English means so much, right? It could mean almost doubt about anything, doubt about how to travel back to Colombo or something like that. There's so many possibilities. But of course, on the path, it's a very specific kind of doubt. And the way this doubt is defined in the suttas is doubt about what is wholesome and what is unwholesome. That is what it really means. And of course, until you attain samadhi, there will always be some of that doubt there, because you don't know your mind all that well yet. The mind is still, slightly terra incognito. You don't really know. It's kind of the unknown terrain, so to speak, that you have to traverse before you actually get to samadhi. So some doubt will be there. But then you keep on investigating, and this is what this, of course, is all about. You keep on investigating what is wholesome, what is unwholesome, what is kusala, what is akusala, is the Pali terms here. And as you do that, as you continue that investigation, doubt is abandoned. Doubt is not abandoned by applying faith. Oh, I will just have faith. That is a kind of Christian idea. No, doubt is abandoned by investigation in Buddhism, to come to understand what is going on. And by understanding, that is how doubt is abandoned. So doubt, maybe uncertainty would be a better translation, because doubt has certain kind of Christian connotations, perhaps. I must admit, I don't really know much about Christianity, but I have some vague ideas about how these words are used. And so that is how doubts arise. Doubts arise through wrong investigation, through ayoniso manasikara. That's one way. And by investigating in the right way, it comes to be abandoned. And then by attaining samadhi again and again, that is how it keeps it down, and it doesn't actually arise again. In this way, he abides contemplating certain principles internally, or he abides contemplating certain principles externally, or he abides contemplating certain principles both internally and externally, and he abides independent, not clinging to anything in the world. That is how a bhikkhu abides contemplating certain principles in terms of the 5 hindrances, the pancha nivarana. So, again, internally, externally, regarding yourself, regarding others, and then you universalize, regarding every being in the universe, the same thing applies. There is no escape from these things. These laws are universal laws that applies everywhere. This is the final insight you have at stream entry when you see the universal characteristics of these things. And then you abide independent, right, of anything in the world. Independent, it means that again, you are independent in the sense that you have gone beyond these hindrances. This is what happens as you contemplate them, and you don't cling to anything in the world. And here in the world would seem to mean the world of the five senses, the world where these hindrances actually exist. Okay, so this is how you do that. So that is the five hindrances for you. Very important contemplation, obviously, to understand this. Now, the next one here that I have next is the 7 awakening factors. And for those of you who know the Satipatthana Sutta will know that between there comes the Salayatana, the 6 sense bases normally come between there. Is that right? I think so. I think they come between there. And then at the very end comes, after the awakening factors comes the, no, after the Salayatana comes, what comes after Salayatana? Is it the 5 aggregates? I can't remember the sequence now. Anyway, the 5 aggregates are in there as well, and the very last one is the 4 noble truths. That is the very last one that occurs in this list. And as you will notice, I have again picked out only 2 of these 5 contemplations. The 2 I have picked out is the 5 hindrances and the 7 awakening factors. So why? And again, this is based on a comparative study of the various versions of the Satipatthana Sutta. And when you do that, there are the two contemplations that are found everywhere, and that is the hindrances and the awakening factors, the bojjhangas. This is found everywhere, and all universal aspects. Whereas the other ones, especially the aggregates and the 4 noble truths, these are only found in the Pali version and nowhere else. So these seem to be, quite possibly, might be a special result of the evolution of the suttas in the Pali. And the sense bases, the Salayatana, that is kind of exists in some versions but not in others. So it's a bit kind of in between. But these 2 ones seem to be the fundamental, the basic exercises of contemplation of phenomena are these 2 things. And you can see why, right? Hindrances, and then after the hindrances are abandoned, that is when the awakening factors start to arise. These are like in the suttas, the hindrances and the awakening factors are like opposite things almost. And as the hindrances go down, the awakening factors come into existence. They are like almost, what is that called? They're almost not antonyms, well, anyway, something like that. So the opposites. When the hindrances are strong, the awakening factors are weak. When the hindrances are weak, the awakening factors are strong. When the hindrances disappear completely, then all you have are the awakening factors. And then you can continue developing the awakening factors even beyond that, right? Even higher, higher and higher and higher. So even after the hindrances are gone, you still continue developing the mind to become even more powerful through the various jhanas and even beyond that. So these are opposites, and that's why they function very well as a pair, and they function very well in this way together in the last aspect of the Satipatthana Sutta. So this is how the contemplation of the awakening factors go. By the way, why are they called awakening factors? It's because they lead to awakening. That's what it specifically says in one of the suttas, in the Bojjhanga Samyutta, the connected discourses on the awakening factors. Okay, and bhikkhus, again bhikkhus, a bhikkhu abides contemplating mind objects or certain principles in terms of the 7 awakening factors. And how does a bhikkhu abide contemplating certain principles in terms of the 7 awakening factors? Here, there being the mindfulness awakening factor in him, a bhikkhu understands there is the mindfulness awakening factor in me. Or there being no mindfulness awakening factor in him, he understands there is no mindfulness awakening factor in me. And he also understands how there comes to be the arising of the unarisen mindfulness and awakening factor, and how the arisen mindfulness awakening factor comes to fulfillment by development. There's a slight doubling there of the text, but so this is what you do. So the awakening factor of mindfulness. What is the awakening factor of mindfulness? Basically, it is the satipatthanas themselves. So when you come to satipatthana and you practice satipatthana, your mindfulness is sufficiently strong for that practice. That then is the awakening factor of mindfulness. It is actually defined slightly differently in different places. So again, there is room for interpretation here. Like I said before, it is not necessarily only one thing that is true. In another place it is said that a bhikkhu recalls the suttas, right? He remembers the suttas. And by remembering the suttas, he actually is practicing the awakening factor of mindfulness as a consequence. So just by reflecting on the suttas, remembering on the suttas, that is already happening here. Another possibility, which I think also would probably be an acceptable interpretation, is the anusatis, the recollections, like the 6 recollections. When they are practiced in the right way, they too lead to the abandoning of the hindrances, right? And the anusatis, of course, are the buddhanusati, dhammanusati, sanghanusati, silanusati, chaganusati, and devanusati, or devatanusati here. So these are, buddhanusati, right? Recollection of the Buddha, recollection of Dhamma, recollection of Sangha, recollection of virtuous conduct, recollection of generosity, and recollection of the devas is the last one here. So these are just different ways of giving rise to that mindfulness where the hindrances are more or less abandoned. And they all are a function of so they're all. This is how this mindfulness factor comes into being here. And so then the question. So then, first of all, you have to understand what mindfulness is again, right? To know what it is when it's present. This is very useful to get so used to your mind that you know roughly when you are mindful and when you're not. Because once you know that, you know whether you're ready to watch the breath, whether you're ready to do satipatthana practice, whether you can do these things, or whether you need to do something preliminary to purify the mind. The more we understand the mind, the more we understand where we're at on the path, the easier it is to apply ourselves in the right way. If you don't really understand what's going on in your mind, it's very difficult to know how you should apply yourself. The more clarity you have about your own mind, the more clarity you have about how to apply the practice. So you know these things, and you know how the unarisen mindfulness enlightenment factor comes to be. It's a bit of a mouthful saying that, the unarisen mindfulness enlightenment factor. How does it come to be? And how does it come to be? And this is one of the things that we have been talking about as well, and it comes to be through sila. It is a virtue that gives rise to mindfulness. In particular, the most important, the last kind of thing you do in sila is the indriya samvara sila, the sense restraint, right? The ability to deal with the input into the senses in such a way that it doesn't give rise to desire or aversion, that the mind stays relatively even, perhaps not 100% even, but fairly even throughout the day. And when that those desire and aversion is abandoned, that is when mindfulness comes to the forth, because there's nothing there to take the mind into the past or into the future, etc. So that's how it happens, and how the arisen mindfulness enlightenment factor comes to fulfillment by development. And that, of course, is just by continuing the practice, continuing the anapanasati, continuing entering deep states of samadhi, abandoning the defilements and all these kind of things. This is how this is then comes to be fulfilled through the further development of the path. So that is the first one, the first of these bojjhangas, factors of awakening here. It's quite exciting, isn't it? This is all about the factors that lead to awakening here. It's quite useful to know that. And what you will see here is that many of these factors, again, are very similar to the very first sutta we did on this retreat, which was the Chaitanya Sutta on volition, on how, what I call the psychology of meditation, how you go through the various stages of meditation, right? Remember that? We were talking about first sila, then abhipattisara, non-regret or non-remorse, then pramudja, piti, passaddhi, sukha, samadhi, yatabhuta jnanadasana. Right? So I don't know if most of you probably know those words by now. Gladness, rapture, tranquility, happiness, samadhi, and then seeing things in accordance with reality. So this is very similar to that. So you can see how the same themes reoccur in the suttas again and again in slightly different guises, slightly different ways. So then we have the next one is there being the investigation of states, enlightenment factor in him. Dhamma vichaya. Dhamma again is more likely here to refer to the qualities of mind, if you like, the states of mind. So you investigate the qualities of mind. And the way that this particular factor is explained in the suttas, it is explained again as understanding the dark states and the bright states, understanding the wholesome states and the unwholesome states, understanding the blameworthy states and the blameless states. That is roughly how it is explained, defined elsewhere. And again, you can see it's very, very similar to what we're talking about when we're talking about understanding the hindrances and the opposite of the hindrances. This is very similar to the previous exercise in understanding the hindrances itself. So very close to that. And you can see why that is the case, right? First you have the awakening factors of mindfulness, and then to purify that awakening factor of mindfulness fully, you come to the fourth satipatthana, which is the abandoning of the hindrances, which then is coming in here, the investigation of states. First you have ordinary mindfulness, then you have the investigation of states. In satipatthana, first you do the kaya-nupassana, etc., and then you have the abandoning of the hindrances. It's the same process you see in the two places. And then you understand how this arises. First of all, you understand whether it's present in you or not. In other words, whether you understand these things or not, presumably. How it arises. How does this investigation of states arise? And here, again, we need to remember that the bojjhangas, they are a causal sequence as well. So one bojjhanga leading to the next one. So once you have the sati-sambojjhanga, then you can do the investigation of states. That is the cause that leads to that. That is how it comes into existence. And then finally, the development, fulfillment by development is again just continuing the practice, going deeper and deeper into samadhi, right? Attaining the jhanas, and this is how this becomes fulfilled through development. Then we have the awakening factor of energy coming next, the virya sambojjhanga. And virya here is, and before we talked about the sammapadhanas, the right effort on the path, right? So what is the connection between virya and padhana, virya and vayama? Is there a connection between these things? Because the strange thing, of course, is that sammapadhana comes before sammasati. But now we are moving almost above the sammasati, right? With the very last stages of sammasati, moving towards samadhi. So how come virya occurs here, but padhana occurs as the sixth factor of the Noble Eightfold Path? What is the connection between these things? And the connection is that padhana is you applying yourself, you're applying an effort, you're applying the mind to think in the right way, you're applying wisdom to be able to move away from the defilements. Sometimes also applying perhaps a little bit of will. There's always a little bit of will, even with wisdom. But energy is different. Virya in the sutta is a naturally occurring energy in the mind. It's not that you are applying yourself, but it's the energy that occurs as a consequence of your development in the mind. Right? So when the samadhi starts to arise, when the meditation is going very well, the mind is bright, you're feeling happiness, you also feel energy. Not because you are applying yourself, it's just a natural consequence of the path. And this is what is meant by energy here. It's different from padhana in the sense that it's just a naturally occurring phenomenon in the mind itself. So it is used in slightly different ways. If you look at the pancha, the five faculties, the pancha indriya, there it is slightly different. There the virya comes first, then the sati. So there the sequence is slightly different. So what you're seeing there is that sati and virya mindfulness and energy, they're very closely related to each other. When you have one, you tend to have the other. When you have the other, you have the one. They kind of revolve around each other. And also revolving around those two things is pamudja, gladness. The energetic mind is a glad mind. The mindful mind is glad and energetic. These three things almost always go together and revolve around each other. So this is what happens here. How does that happen? It happens from investigation of states, right? Investigation of states is understanding the mind, understanding the defilements, like understanding the hindrances. And because you understand them, because you understand how they arise, how they are abandoned, you abandon those things, and then the virya comes. When the less hindrances there are, the greater the virya will be. So this is how that arises. And again, the fulfillment is just by continued practice, deeper and deeper into samadhi. Then we have the rapture enlightenment factor, the piti sambojjhanga. And piti is again, now you start to recognize the words from the very first sutta, right? The rapture, the piti, may have been called joy there, but it doesn't matter, it's the same Pali word. And this arises from the energy. When the energy becomes stronger, when the pamudja is there, then just by meditating, just by allowing the process to mature by itself, the piti then comes as a consequence. Remember when we're talking about the very first sutta, we were saying that it is dhammata, it is in accordance with nature, that when you have the previous factor, the one afterwards arises. All you have to do is just sit back and wait. And if your sila is good enough, if you have done all the right practices beforehand, it just comes, right? Piti comes by itself. First energy, then piti, moving along like that, naturally by itself. So this is how that comes to be, and the fulfillment again of this is by developing the samadhi. The deeper the samadhi, the more powerful the piti will be, until it reaches its peak in the second jhana. There's no piti beyond that. That is the peak of piti. Then from that comes tranquility, right? Again, looking back at the first sutta, we had piti, then passaddhi, rapture, then tranquility. Exactly the same thing you're seeing here. One coming from the other one leading to the next one. So exactly the same kind of thing. And you learn what these states are by practicing them repeatedly. Again and again, you learn whether you have them or not. You learn how they interact with each other as a natural sequence. And you learn their fulfillment by development. And again, tranquility really gets fulfilled in the second jhana, when the mind becomes completely still and there is no movement anymore. Then we have from that, there is samadhi. In the first sutta we saw, the Chaitanya Sutta, I went from tranquility to sukha and then to samadhi. Here the sukha is kind of part of tranquility, because the tranquility is very happy, and then that happiness is what draws you in to the samadhi. So from tranquility comes samadhi. So you understand what samadhi truly is. And the peak of samadhi is in the second jhana, samadhija, piti sukha. Piti sukha are born of samadhi in the second jhana. That's when it comes to the final kind of samadhi here. And last but not least, there being the equanimity, upekkha, awakening factor in him. The bhikkhu understands there is the equanimity awakening factor in me. And there being no equanimity awakening factor in him, he understands there is no equanimity awakening factor in me. And he also understands how there comes to be the arising of the unarisen equanimity awakening factor, and how the arisen equanimity awakening factor comes to fulfillment by development. So this is the highest of all the bojjhangas, the upekkha. Equanimity is one possible translation. Another one might simply just be even-mindedness. Your mind is incredibly even at this point, so completely placid and even. Nothing can budge you. This is why this is called the anenja state, the imperturbable. You can no longer be perturbed, right? Being perturbed means you get slightly agitated or worried or whatever it is. Here you are completely imperturbable. You're just watching everything with a completely steady, immovable, kind of even mind all the way through. This is what equanimity is. And this is achieved at the highest. Really reaches its peak in the fourth jhana. That's when you come to the highest degree of equanimity. And that is when the mind is equanimous. And that is why the fourth jhana is the most powerful of state for reaching any awakening, for remembering any past life, for having any kind of insight. Precisely because the mind is imperturbable. It can no longer be moved by the worldly things, and for that reason you are able to make a breakthrough at this point. So if you haven't made a breakthrough before, at this point your mind is ready for that. So again, it is samadhi that leads to this equanimity, right? So the deeper the samadhi, you're moving towards equanimity in the fourth jhana, and again, it reaches its fulfillment by development, by practicing all the factors to the very end of the Noble Eightfold Path. So, those are the awakening factors. These are the things that make awakening possible. These are the qualities of mind that make awakening possible. When you have fulfilled all these qualities of mind, when they're all present, then awakening will happen as a matter of course. And you can't really stop it anymore. It will just happen as a result of this. So that's why the fourth jhana is kind of the peak, the end of the path, because that is when awakening will happen. In this way, he abides contemplating mind objects as mind or principles, certain principles internally, certain principles externally, certain principles both internally and externally. And he abides independent, not clinging to anything in the world. That is how a bhikkhu abides contemplating certain principles in terms of the 7 awakening factors. So, there you are, these 7 awakening factors, and this is what we are trying to achieve. And as you move into your meditation and you start to feel a little bit of piti, you're starting to get the very foundation of these awakening factors arising in your mind, right? When you feel a bit of piti, you feel kind of the exhilaration inside, things are going the right way. That is the beginning of these things developing inside of you. It's exciting, isn't it? These are the awakening factors coming up. You know, right? You have some idea what awakening is all about. You can feel it inside of you. So this is kind of what this is. It's very dry when you read about these things. It kind of, you can read this and you can kind of do it intellectually, and it's very kind of boring. But remember, these are real experiences, right? And that's when it gets very kind of exciting. Wow, this is the awakening factor I'm feeling here, right? The beginning of the awakening factor. And then you get inspired, because this is kind of, this is moving you towards enlightenment, towards the highest stages of the Buddhist path. So it's about inspiring yourself, thinking about these things in the right way. When you think about them in the right way, it kind of pushes you, right? And you feel the path is taking over by itself. So let's do the very last part of the Satipatthana Sutta before time runs out, if it hasn't run out already. But we will just do this very quickly. And this can be done quickly because this last part here is like the summarizing verse, and it occurs only occasionally in the Satipatthana Suttas. So this is not foundational, it is not so important, but we will just read it anyway because it is maybe we shouldn't read it. Actually, we read it anyway, just for the fun of it. Because if anyone should develop these 4 focuses of mindfulness in such a way for 7 years, one of 2 fruits could be expected for him. Either final knowledge here and now, ditte vadamme anya, anya is like final knowledge, or there is a trace of clinging left, then non-returning, the anagamita. So these are the 2 things. So either you become an arahant or you become a non-returner. This is what it says here, if you practice this fully here. That's pretty good deal, isn't it? So just go for it. Let alone 7 years, because if anyone should develop these 4 focuses of mindfulness in such a way for 6 years, for 5 years, for 4 years, for 3 years, for 2 years, for 1 year, one of 2 fruits could be expected for him. Either final knowledge here and now, or if there is a trace of clinging left, non-returning. let alone 1 year bhikkhus. If anyone should develop these 4 focuses of mindfulness in such a way for 7 months, for 6 months, for 5 months, for 4 months, for 3 months, for 2 months, for 1 month, for half a month, one of 2 fruits could be expected for him, either final knowledge here and now, or there being a trace of clinging left, non-returning. Let alone half a month, bhikkhus. If anyone should develop these 4 foundations of mindfulness in such a way for 7 days, one of 2 fruits could be expected of him, either final knowledge here and now, or if there's a trace of clinging left, non-returning. And in some of the other version of the Sutta, it goes down all the way to 1 day even. It says in 1 day this can happen. So why is it that there are these promises of different time lengths? It just depends on how developed you are, right? If you already got the 4th jhana, it will be very, very quick. If you're kind of struggling with, with sloth and torpor, then of course it's going to take a little bit longer. So it all depends on where on the path you are, and then eventually you will get there. But also remember that this particular passage here, it is only true if you have mindfulness already, right? So you already have to have mindfulness. So you can only practice the 4 focus of mindfulness if you already have mindfulness. One of the things I said at the beginning, sattima is one of the adjectives used there to describe the person practicing this thing here. Because only when you have mindfulness already, in other words, you're already fairly developed, only then does this kind of prediction come into force. But again, it is not core to the Satipatthana Sutta, and if you look at the numbers here, they're quite little bit strange numbers, right? He starts off with 7 years, goes down to 1 year, and then he jumps to 7 months, right? Then goes down to 1 month. The number 7 sort of stands out here, and that makes you wonder what is going on. And the possibility, of course, is that if this is a later addition, the word 7 has some kind of slightly mythological meaning, right? Some special meaning. So it's added in there to give a kind of boost of faith or confidence or something like that. This is often what you can see sometimes in the suttas, that some editor has kind of added a few devas and a few devas becoming awakened and these things. You often find that at the end of the suttas, not as the word of the Buddha, but as the word of some editor who has added these things later on. And this could perhaps have happened here as well, although it is hard to know exactly what is going on here. Okay, final paragraph. So it was with reference to this that it was said, because this is the path leading in one direction only for the purification of beings, for the surmounting of sorrow and lamentation, for the disappearance of pain and grief, for the attainment of the true way, in other words, the understanding of dependent origination, for becoming a stream entry, and for the realization of extinguishment, becoming an arahant, namely the 4 focuses of mindfulness. One little thing I didn't comment on before, which I see now that I'm reading this, is the direct path, or the path leading in one direction only for the purification of beings, right? It doesn't say for the purification of humans, but for beings. And what that implies is that there are probably also other beings who can practice this and gain the results of awakening. And of course the obvious ones, if you're an animal, you're not going to be able to practice these things. You look at the animals, don't have those faculties. So the obvious beings are obviously the devas. The devas are the ones that can practice these things as well. And we see that in the sutta as the devas reaching the stages of awakening here. So perhaps, it's just my guess, perhaps that's the reason why the word beings is used there rather than humans. That is what the Blessed One said. The bhikkhus were satisfied and delighted in the Blessed One's words. Okay, so there you are, the Satipatthana Sutta, and that is all for now, and we'll see you again this evening.